Alexander Morrison thought he'd seen everything money could buy. But at 3 a.m., watching a teenager scrub pans in his kitchen with bleeding hands, he discovered the one thing his billions couldn't purchase: the truth about sacrifice. The penthouse kitchen of Morrison Tower gleamed under motion sensor lights that flickered on at precisely 3:17 a.m. Alexander Morrison had descended from his master suite, driven by insomnia and the vague notion that a glass of expensive whiskey might help him forget another day of empty victories and meaningless acquisitions. At 48 years old, Alexander had built an empire that spanned 3 continents. Morrison Enterprises controlled everything from luxury hotels to tech startups, generating wealth that most people couldn't comprehend in a lifetime. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the tallest building in the city, a monument to success that felt increasingly like a gilded cage. But nothing in his carefully constructed world had prepared him for what he found that night. The sound hit him first, a quiet, rhythmic scrubbing that seemed out of place in the automated silence of his home. Then came the soft gasp of pain, barely audible, but unmistakable. Alexander froze in the hallway, his hand hovering over the kitchen entrance. Through the partially open door he saw her. A young woman, no, practically still a girl, stood at the industrial sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing a large pan with an intensity that spoke of desperation rather than diligence. Her shoulders were hunched with exhaustion, and even from this distance, Alexander could see her hands trembling. What struck him most was the silence of her suffering. She didn't complain, didn't cry out, just continued the mechanical motion of cleaning with a determination that seemed almost heartbreaking in someone so young. Alexander pushed the door open fully. The girl spun around, her eyes wide with terror, soap suds flying from her hands onto the pristine floor. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. The billionaire in his expensive silk pajamas and the teenager in worn clothes that had clearly been mended multiple times. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "What are you doing in my kitchen at 3 in the morning?" The girl's face drained of what little color it had. I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison. I didn't mean to disturb you. I was just finishing the dishes from the dinner party. I'll be done soon. Please, I'm sorry." Her accent carried the musical lilt of someone for whom English was a second language, each word carefully pronounced as if she'd practiced them. But it was the raw fear in her voice that made Alexander pause. This wasn't the casual nervousness of an employee caught slacking off. This was the terror of someone who couldn't afford to lose what little they had. "I asked who you are," Alexander repeated, his tone softening slightly. "I know everyone who works in this building. I've never seen you before." "I'm Elena, sir, Maria's daughter." She gestured vaguely toward the service quarters where the live-in staff resided. "My mother is your housekeeper. She wasn't feeling well tonight, so I'm helping her finish her duties." Alexander's mind raced. Maria. Yes. He vaguely remembered a woman who cleaned his penthouse, though he'd never paid much attention to her beyond ensuring his spaces remained immaculate. The realization that he couldn't clearly picture the face of someone who worked in his home daily sent an uncomfortable pang through his chest. "Where is your mother now?" he asked. "Resting, sir. She has a fever, but she didn't want to worry you. The dinner party generated more work than usual, and she asked me to help so everything would be perfect for your morning." Alexander stepped closer, and that's when he saw them clearly. Elena's hands. They were raw and red, with small cuts bleeding slightly, where the harsh dish soap had found open wounds. Some of the cuts looked old, barely healed before being reopened by tonight's work. "Your hands are bleeding," he said, unable to keep the shock from his voice. Elena quickly hid them behind her back, as if the injury was shameful. "It's nothing, sir. I'm almost done. I promise I'll clean up any blood I might have gotten on the dishes. I'll rewash everything." The casual way she spoke about her pain, the immediate assumption that her suffering was less important than the cleanliness of his dishes, struck Alexander like a physical blow. When had the world become so skewed that a child, because despite her attempts at mature composure she couldn't be more than 16 or 17, accepted injury as the price of employment? "How old are you, Elena?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, clearly afraid the truth might get her or her mother in trouble. 17, sir. And where should you be at 3 in the morning on a school night? The question seemed to physically hurt her more than her wounded hands. Her eyes dropped to the floor, and her voice became barely audible. I don't go to school anymore, Mr. Morrison. Why not? Because someone has to work, sir. The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if she were stating something as obvious as the sky being blue. My mother's salary covers our basic needs, but my younger brother, Miguel, he's brilliant. He has a chance at a real future if he can stay in school, if he can go to university someday. So I work nights at the diner on 5th Street, and I help my mother when she needs it. And that way Miguel can keep studying. Alexander felt something shifting in his chest, an uncomfortable sensation he couldn't immediately identify. Your mother knows you've dropped out of school to work? She cried for weeks when I told her. Elena's voice cracked slightly, the first real emotion breaking through her carefully maintained composure. But she also knows I'm right. We can't afford for both of us to study. Miguel is younger, smarter. He has a better chance. I'm good at working. I can make sacrifices he shouldn't have to make. The word sacrifices hung in the air like an accusation. Alexander thought about his own day, a business lunch that cost more than this girl probably earned in a month, a watch he'd purchased on impulse for an amount that could have funded someone's education, a life where the biggest decision was which luxury car to take to which exclusive restaurant. What time do you finish at the diner? He asked. My shift ends at 2. Then I come here to help my mother if she needs it. Then I go home, sleep a few hours and start again. Every night? 6 nights a week. Sundays I rest. She said it as if this grueling schedule was perfectly reasonable, as if 17-year-olds were meant to function on 3 or 4 hours of sleep while their hands bled into dish soap. Alexander moved to the kitchen island and sat down heavily on one of the bar stools. Sit down, Elena. Sir, I really should finish. That wasn't a request. His tone was firm but not unkind. Sit down, please. Elena reluctantly took a seat across from him, her posture rigid with anxiety. She kept her injured hands hidden in her lap, but Alexander could see the occasional wince that indicated the pain hadn't stopped just because she was trying to hide it. Tell me about Miguel, Alexander said. Your brother. Confusion flickered across Elena's face. She'd clearly expected punishment, dismissal, perhaps both. A simple question about her family seemed to disorient her more than anger would have. He's 14, she began hesitantly. He's in the accelerated program at Lincoln Academy. His teachers say he has a gift for mathematics and science. They think he could get scholarships, maybe even to prestigious universities, if he keeps performing at this level. And you gave up your own education so he could keep his. It wasn't a question, but Elena answered anyway. Someone had to choose, Mr. Morrison. In families like mine, not everyone gets to chase their dreams. We calculate who has the best chance of breaking the cycle, and we invest everything in that person. Miguel is that person for us. And what were your dreams, Elena? Before you became the person who sacrificed them? The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, Alexander saw past the exhausted worker to the teenage girl beneath, someone who had once imagined a different future for herself. I wanted to be a teacher, she whispered, and the longing in her voice was almost painful to hear. I love children, love helping them understand new things. I used to tutor younger students at my school before I had to leave. They said I had a gift for making complicated things simple. Past tense. Had a gift. I still have it, I suppose. But gifts don't pay bills, Mr. Morrison. Dreams don't feed families. Work does. So I work. Alexander stood abruptly and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a first aid kit he'd never actually used himself. He returned to the island and opened it, extracting bandages and antiseptic cream. Give me your hands, he said. Elena shrank back. Sir, that's not necessary. They'll heal on their own. I can't let you. Elena, I am many things. Most of them probably not very admirable. But I'm not so far gone that I can watch a child bleed in my kitchen without doing something about it. Give me your hands. Please. Slowly, reluctantly, she extended her injured hands across the marble countertop. Under the bright kitchen lights, they looked even worse than Alexander had initially thought. The cuts were numerous and deep in places, the skin raw and inflamed from hours of exposure to harsh chemicals and hot water. As he gently cleaned and bandaged her wounds, Alexander found himself thinking about the contrast between their hands. His were soft, manicured weekly by a professional, unmarked by any real labor. Hers told the story of someone who'd been working since childhood, someone who understood the price of survival in a way he never had and never would. "Why are you being kind to me?" Elena asked suddenly, her voice small and confused. "People like you don't usually notice people like me, except to point out what we've done wrong." The observation stung because it was accurate. How many Elenas had passed through his life, invisible in their service, their struggles beneath his notice? How many bleeding hands had he simply never seen because he'd never bothered to look? "Maybe I'm tired of being people like me," Alexander said quietly. "Maybe I'm tired of living in a bubble so thick that I don't even know when the people who keep my life running are suffering." He finished bandaging her hands and stepped back. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go to bed. Today, actually. You're going to sleep as long as your body needs to sleep. Then we're going to have a conversation about your situation and what can be done about it. Mr. Morrison, I can't lose this opportunity for my mother. If she loses her position because No one is losing anything," Alexander interrupted firmly. "Except maybe me losing the ability to sleep at night knowing what I know now. Go to bed, Elena. That's not a request either." Elena stood slowly, her bandaged hands held carefully in front of her. She looked at Alexander with an expression he couldn't quite read, confusion mixed with cautious hope and lingering fear. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "I don't understand why you're doing this, but thank you." After she left, Alexander sat alone in his pristine kitchen, surrounded by appliances that cost more than most people earned in a year, and felt the weight of a revelation he hadn't expected. His insomnia had led him to discover something more disturbing than any business problem he'd ever faced: the human cost of the perfect life he'd built for himself. Somewhere in this building, in cramped service quarters he'd never bothered to visit, a 17-year-old girl was destroying her future to save her brothers, and until tonight, he hadn't even known she existed. The question that kept him awake until dawn wasn't about business strategy or profit margins. It was simpler and infinitely more complicated. What kind of world had he built for himself where this was acceptable? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? Morning arrived with the kind of golden light that only penthouses this high could capture, but Alexander Morrison had been awake to watch the entire sunrise. He'd spent hours at his desk, not working on the usual spreadsheets and acquisition reports, but researching something he'd never thought to investigate before: what it actually cost to live in the city he'd helped build into a playground for the wealthy. The numbers were staggering in ways his business reports never were. Rent for a basic apartment consumed half of minimum wage earnings. Healthcare was a luxury. Education, even public education, came with hidden costs that could devastate a struggling family. He'd known these facts intellectually, the way one knows abstract statistics, but now they had a face. Elena's face. Bleeding hands. Abandoned dreams. At 8 a.m., Alexander made his way to the service quarters, a section of his penthouse he'd never visited in the 3 years he'd lived here. The contrast was jarring. Where his living spaces featured floor-to-ceiling windows and imported marble, the staff areas were cramped and windowless, functional at best, depressing at worst. He knocked on the door marked with a simple nameplate: Maria Santos. The woman who opened the door looked exhausted even after a night's rest. Her face was lined with worry and fever flush, but her eyes widened in shock when she saw who stood at her threshold. "Mr. Morrison!" Maria gasped, immediately trying to smooth her hair and straighten her clothing. "I'm so sorry. I should be working. I know I missed the morning service. I'll make it up, I promise. Please don't—" "May I come in?" Alexander interrupted gently. The question seemed to confuse her more than any anger would have. Employers didn't ask permission to enter staff quarters. They demanded, they inspected, they criticized. They didn't stand politely at doorways waiting for invitation. "Of course, sir. I apologize for the mess. We weren't expecting—" Maria trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the small space behind her. Alexander stepped inside and felt his chest tighten. The entire quarters, meant to house Maria, Elena, and young Miguel, was barely larger than his walk-in closet. 3 narrow beds lined one wall. A hot plate and mini refrigerator constituted the kitchen. A single bathroom with a shower stall so small Alexander doubted he could fit inside it. This was where his housekeeper had been raising 2 children while maintaining his sprawling penthouse to perfection. Miguel sat at a tiny desk wedged between 2 beds, surrounded by textbooks and papers. The boy looked up with intelligent eyes that held both curiosity and caution. He couldn't have been more than 14, slight and scholarly in appearance, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he approached studying the way others approached survival, because for him, they were the same thing. "Mr. Morrison, this is my son Miguel," Maria said, her voice trembling. "Miguel, say hello to Mr. Morrison." "Good morning, sir," Miguel said with careful politeness, but Alexander could see the boy calculating, trying to understand why the building's owner was in their cramped quarters. Elena sat on one of the beds, her bandaged hands resting in her lap. She looked even more exhausted in daylight, dark circles under her eyes testimony to years of insufficient sleep. When she saw Alexander, she stood quickly, almost defensively, as if preparing to shield her family from whatever judgment he'd come to deliver. "Please, everyone sit," Alexander said. "I'm not here to cause problems. I'm here because I need to understand your situation better." "Sir, if this is about last night," Maria began, but Alexander held up his hand. "Last night, I found your daughter bleeding into my dish soap at 3 in the morning because she's working 2 jobs while you're sick. Also, your son can stay in school. That's not a situation I can ignore, Maria. Not anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with fear and confusion. These weren't people accustomed to employers who cared about their circumstances beyond how it affected their performance. "How long have you been working for me?" Alexander asked Maria. 3 years, sir, since you moved into this penthouse. And in 3 years, I never once asked about your family, your needs, your life outside these walls. I never even knew you had children." The admission tasted bitter. "That failure is mine, not yours. But I'm asking now. Tell me everything." Maria exchanged glances with her children, clearly uncertain whether honesty would help or hurt them. Elena gave a small nod, some silent communication passing between mother and daughter. "We came from across the border when Elena was 10 and Miguel was 7, Maria began slowly. "Their father died in an accident at a construction site back home. No insurance, no compensation. I brought them here hoping for a better life, for opportunities they couldn't have where we were from." She continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I work as much as I can, but one income supporting 3 people in this city. It's not enough. The scholarship that got Miguel into Lincoln Academy covers tuition, but not books, supplies, lab fees, field trips. Those things add up. And Elena, she was doing so well in school, but when it came time to choose, I chose," Elena said firmly. "No one forced me. I looked at our situation and I made the rational decision. Miguel has the brighter future potential. I'm good at working. It made sense." "You're 17 years old," Alexander said, and something in his voice made all 3 of them look at him sharply. "You shouldn't have to make those kinds of rational decisions. You should be worried about homework and friends and all the normal things teenagers worry about, not calculating which family member gets to have a future." "That's a nice idea, Mr. Morrison," Elena replied, and there was an edge to her voice now, a hint of the spirit that had driven her to sacrifice so much. "But nice ideas don't pay rent. They don't buy Miguel's textbooks. They don't cover the cost of my mother's medicine when she's sick. We live in the real world, where someone has to make hard choices." "What medicine?" Alexander asked sharply. Maria's face flushed. "It's nothing, sir. Just some antibiotics I need occasionally. The fever comes and goes. I manage. She has a chronic infection," Elena translated bluntly. "She needs proper treatment, but the clinic charges $200 for the medication she needs, and that's $200 we don't have. So she takes over-the-counter fever reducers and hopes for the best." Alexander felt anger rising in his chest, but not at them, at himself, at a system that made these choices necessary, at the comfortable ignorance he'd wrapped himself in. "Why didn't you ask me for help? For an advance on your salary? For anything?" Maria looked genuinely confused by the question. "Mr. Morrison, with respect, people like you don't help people like us. You pay us to do a job. If we can't do the job, you replace us. That's how the world works. I couldn't risk asking for special treatment and losing the one stable income we have." The casual acceptance of this hierarchy, the assumption that her suffering was simply the price of employment, struck Alexander as profoundly wrong. When had he become the kind of person who inspired that level of fear in people who depended on him? "Things are going to change," Alexander said decisively. "Starting now. Mr. Morrison, please." Maria stood, her hands clasped together almost in prayer. "If you're going to fire me, I understand. But please, let me work until I can find something else. We need every week's salary I can earn. And Elena didn't mean any disrespect. She's a good girl, just tired and—" "I'm not firing anyone," Alexander interrupted, appalled that this was her immediate assumption. "I'm going to fix this situation. All of it." "Sir, we don't need charity," Elena said, her pride evident despite her exhaustion. "We're not asking for handouts. We work for what we have. This isn't charity. This is—" Alexander paused, searching for the right words. "This is me correcting a massive oversight in how I run my life and my business. You've been working for me for 3 years, Maria, maintaining my home perfectly while raising 2 children in a space barely fit for 1 person. That's not right. Elena, you've been destroying your future to save your brothers while I haven't even noticed there was a problem. That's not acceptable." He pulled out his phone. "First thing, Maria, you're taking the rest of the week off with full pay to recover properly. I'm having a doctor sent here today, a real doctor, not a clinic, and they'll provide whatever medication you need at no cost to you." "Mr. Morrison, I can't," Maria protested, but Alexander continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Second, Elena, you're not going back to the diner. You're going to re-enroll in school." "I can't afford—" Elena started, but Alexander raised his hand. "I'm establishing an education fund. It will cover everything for both of you. Tuition, books, supplies, everything. Miguel's expenses at Lincoln Academy, and Elena's return to school, wherever she chooses to go." The 3 family members stared at him as if he'd started speaking another language. Miguel's mouth hung open slightly. Maria's eyes filled with tears. Elena looked almost angry, as if this kindness was somehow an insult. "Why?" Elena demanded. "Why would you do this? What do you want from us in return?" The question revealed so much about her experience with the world. That kindness always came with a price, that no one helped without expecting something back. "Because I can," Alexander said simply. "Because finding you bleeding into my dish soap at 3 in the morning made me realize I've been living in a bubble so thick I've forgotten what matters. Because maybe I want to be the kind of person who does something when he sees injustice, instead of just pretending not to see it." "But we're nothing to you," Elena whispered, and there was pain in her voice. "We're just the people who clean your floors and wash your dishes. Tomorrow you'll forget about this moment of generosity, and we'll be right back where we started. Except now we'll have hoped for something better. Hope hurts worse than acceptance, Mr. Morrison. At least acceptance is honest." Her words cut deeper than any business rival's insults ever had, because she was right, in a way. How many times had he made charitable gestures that felt good in the moment but changed nothing fundamental? How many times had he written a check and considered his conscience cleared? "You're right to be suspicious," Alexander admitted. "I've been that person, the one who makes grand gestures and forgets about them. But something changed last night. I can't unsee what I saw. I can't unknow what I now know. And I can either do something meaningful about it, or I can prove you right and be exactly the person you expect me to be." He looked at each of them in turn. "I'm going to do something meaningful. But here's the truth. I don't actually know how. I don't know what it's like to choose between family members' futures. I don't know what it's like to work until my hands bleed. I don't know what it's like to be sick and unable to afford medicine. So I'm going to need your help to get this right." "Our help?" Maria repeated, as if the concept of helping her employer was backwards. "Yes. I want to understand what's broken in the system that made your situation possible. I want to know what needs to change so that no one else has to make the choices you've had to make. And I want to start by making sure you 3 have everything you need, not as charity, but as what should have been provided from the beginning." Miguel spoke for the first time since the initial greeting. "Are you real?" he asked, his young voice filled with wonder and skepticism in equal measure. "Or are we going to wake up tomorrow and find out this was just a dream?" Alexander found himself smiling despite the heaviness of the situation. "I'm real, and this is real. And tomorrow, when you wake up, things are going to start changing. I promise you that. Promises are easy. Elena said quietly. Following through is hard. Then watch me follow through, Alexander challenged. Give me a chance to prove that not everyone with money is too blind to see or too selfish to care. The conversation continued for another hour, Alexander taking notes on his phone about expenses, needs, dreams that had been deferred or abandoned. He learned that Miguel wanted to be an engineer, that Elena's teaching dreams had included working with immigrant children like herself, that Maria's chronic infection had started from an injury sustained while working but never properly treated, because she couldn't afford to miss work or pay for care. Each revelation was another indictment of the world Alexander had helped create. A world where people who worked the hardest often had the least, where one medical emergency could derail an entire family, where bright children had to choose between their education and their family's survival. When he finally left their cramped quarters, Alexander had a mission that felt more important than any business deal he'd ever made. He spent the rest of the day making calls, setting up accounts, arranging for doctors and lawyers and educational consultants. But as he worked, Elena's words echoed in his mind. Hope hurts worse than acceptance. He had to make sure this hope didn't hurt. He had to follow through not just today, not just this week, but in a way that created lasting change. Because if he failed, if he proved Elena right and abandoned them back to their struggle, he would become something worse than the ignorant billionaire he'd been before. He would become the billionaire who saw suffering and chose to do nothing. And somehow that thought was unbearable. Days after his discovery in the kitchen, Alexander Morrison found himself in a place he'd never expected to visit. Lincoln Academy, the prestigious private school where Miguel studied. The principal's office was decorated with plaques celebrating academic excellence and photographs of successful alumni, testament to an institution that shaped future leaders, provided you could afford the entry fee. Principal Victoria Hartwell was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that had evaluated thousands of students over decades. She sat across from Alexander with the polite wariness of someone accustomed to wealthy benefactors who wanted their generosity acknowledged publicly. "Mr. Morrison, it's an honor to have you visit our humble institution," she began with practiced charm. "When you called requesting this meeting, I was intrigued. How can Lincoln Academy serve you today?" "I'm here about one of your students, Miguel Santos," Alexander said directly, "and his sister, Elena Santos, who should be attending school but isn't." Principal Hartwell's expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. Yes, Miguel. Brilliant boy, truly exceptional in mathematics and sciences. One of our scholarship students. He's doing remarkably well given his circumstances." The slight pause before circumstances didn't escape Alexander's notice. What circumstances would those be? Well, you understand. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds often face challenges that our more privileged students don't encounter. Miguel has done admirably, despite lacking the resources many of his peers take for granted. We're quite proud of how far he's come. "And his sister Elena," Alexander pressed. "I understand she was also an excellent student before she had to withdraw." Principal Hartwell's expression became almost pitying. "Elena Santos attended Lincoln Academy for 1 year on partial scholarship. Lovely girl, very dedicated. But the financial burden became too much for the family. It's unfortunate, but it happens. Some families simply can't sustain the investment required for quality education. She didn't withdraw because her family couldn't sustain the investment," Alexander said, his voice hardening. "She withdrew because she had to work 2 jobs to support her family, because her mother is sick and can't afford proper medical care, because Miguel's full scholarship apparently doesn't cover books, supplies, lab fees, and a dozen other expenses that can devastate a struggling family." The principal shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you may have developed some personal interest in this family, but Lincoln Academy has limited resources for financial aid. We provide scholarships to deserving students, but we cannot be expected to cover every incidental expense. Families must contribute according to their means." "Families like the Santos have no means," Alexander countered. "You've created a system where you can claim to help disadvantaged students while still ensuring they're constantly reminded of their disadvantage. Miguel is surrounded by classmates who don't worry about whether they can afford a textbook or a field trip. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? We encourage all our students to be resourceful," Principal Hartwell said stiffly. "Miguel has access to our library, to use textbooks when available. He's never complained. Of course he hasn't complained. Because children like Miguel learn early that complaining gets you nowhere except dismissed as ungrateful. They learn to be invisible, to make do, to never ask for help because asking might mean losing what little they have. Alexander leaned forward, his businessman's instinct for negotiation kicking in. Here's what's going to happen. Elena Santos is going to re-enroll at Lincoln Academy. I'm establishing an education fund that will cover full expenses for both Elena and Miguel. Tuition, books, supplies, technology, field trips, everything. No child should have to calculate the cost of education while they're trying to learn. Principal Hartwell's eyebrows rose. That's very generous, Mr. Morrison, but Elena missed significant coursework when she withdrew. She'd be behind her peers.
Perhaps it would be more practical for her to pursue alternatives. A GED program, community college eventually. She's 17 years old, and she was an honors student before she had to sacrifice her education for her brothers. She doesn't need alternatives. She needs to return to school with full support and the expectation that she will succeed.
I appreciate your enthusiasm, the principal said with barely concealed condescension. But you must understand that students from Elena's background often struggle with the academic rigor here, even without the interruption. The cultural capital, the preparation, the family support systems, these things matter. We can't simply throw money at the problem and expect it to resolve. Alexander felt anger building in his chest. What I understand is that you've built an institution that prides itself on excellence, while systematically excluding anyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of deserving. Elena's background isn't a deficit to be overcome. It's a perspective your privileged students desperately need exposure to. Mr. Morrison, I think you're being somewhat naive about the realities of education. No, Alexander interrupted sharply. I think I'm finally seeing clearly after years of being blind. Elena Santos will be re-enrolling at Lincoln Academy. The Santos Family Education Fund will cover every expense. And if this institution cannot support two brilliant students who've already proven their dedication against impossible odds, then perhaps I need to reconsider the substantial donations I've made to Lincoln Academy over the years. The threat hung in the air, crude but effective. Principal Hartwell's expression froze, then carefully rearranged itself into something more accommodating. Of course, Mr. Morrison. I'm sure we can make arrangements for Elena's return. Lincoln Academy always supports its students' success. I simply wanted to ensure you understood the challenges involved. I understand the challenges perfectly, Alexander said, standing to leave. I expect Elena to be welcomed back with the same respect and support offered to any student here. Am I clear? Crystal clear, Mr. Morrison. As Alexander left the academy, he felt both triumph and disgust. He'd won this battle, but only by leveraging his wealth and influence. The same tools that had created the inequality he was now trying to fight. Was he really changing anything fundamental, or just using money to buy exceptions to broken rules? His next stop offered no comfort. At Morrison Enterprises headquarters, his executive team had gathered for their weekly strategy meeting. But today, Alexander had added an unusual item to the agenda. I'm establishing a new initiative, Alexander announced to the 12 executives seated around the conference table. The Morrison Opportunity Fund will provide comprehensive support to employees and their families, education, healthcare, emergency assistance. We're going to ensure that no one working for this company or its subsidiaries faces the kind of impossible choices that destroy families. The silence that followed was heavy with confusion and concern. Finally, Gerald Blackwood, his chief financial officer, spoke up. Alexander, that's commendable, I suppose. But have you calculated the cost? We employ over 3,000 people directly, and our subsidiaries employ tens of thousands more. The financial exposure could be enormous. I don't care about the financial exposure, Alexander said flatly. We posted record profits last quarter while people working in this building couldn't afford basic medical care. That's unacceptable. But it's not our responsibility, interjected Diane Patterson, the Human Resources Director. We offer competitive salaries for our market. What employees do with their compensation is their business. If they make poor financial choices, Alexander felt his temper rising. I recently learned that one of our housekeeping staff has been working while chronically ill because she couldn't afford both medicine and rent. Her teenage daughter dropped out of school to work multiple jobs. Those aren't poor choices. That's survival in a system we've created. One anecdotal case doesn't represent, Gerald began, but Alexander cut him off. How many anecdotal cases do we need before we acknowledge systematic failure? How many of our employees are struggling while we debate quarterly earnings and executive bonuses? Marcus Chen, the company's general counsel, leaned forward with concern. Alexander, I understand you've been moved by a personal encounter, but we have fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders. Establishing expensive benefit programs could impact stock prices, invite lawsuits from investors who claim we're being financially irresponsible. Then let them sue, Alexander said. I'd rather defend treating employees humanely than explain why we didn't. The meeting devolved into heated debate. His executives argued about implementation, cost management, precedent setting. They weren't cruel people, Alexander realized. They were simply operating within a system that had taught them to value efficiency and profit above human welfare. This initiative is happening, Alexander said firmly at the meeting's end. You can help me implement it effectively, or you can update your resumes. Those are the options. After the executives filed out, several wearing expressions of disbelief, Alexander sat alone in the conference room and wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. Not morally. He was certain he was doing the right thing, but practically. Could one person really change a system this entrenched? Or would his efforts collapse under the weight of institutional resistance? His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Morrison, this is Elena. Miguel came home from school today crying. Someone told him he only still attends Lincoln because a rich man feels sorry for us. Is that what we are now? Charity cases who need to be grateful? The message hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He'd been so focused on fixing the practical problems that he hadn't considered the emotional complexity of his intervention. He'd swooped in with money and authority, assuming gratitude would follow. But dignity wasn't something you could gift someone by paying their bills. Dignity was something that could be damaged by the very act of rescue if it wasn't done carefully. He called Elena immediately. She answered on the third ring, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Did I make things worse? Alexander asked without preamble. I don't know yet, Elena answered honestly. My mother cried for an hour after the doctor left. She hasn't been pain-free in 2 years, and suddenly she is. Miguel has new textbooks that don't have pages missing. I have a phone call scheduled with Lincoln Academy about re-enrollment. These are all good things. But we went from invisible to visible, and visibility comes with costs. People at Miguel's school are looking at him differently now. Not as the smart kid who works hard, but as the poor kid who needed saving. Our neighbors are asking questions about why we suddenly have nice things, and I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to decide this was a nice idea that's too expensive or complicated to maintain. I'm not going to, Alexander started, but Elena interrupted. You can't promise that. You can't promise you won't get bored with this project, or that your company won't pressure you to stop, or that you won't meet the next sad case and move on to them. That's what rich people do, Mr. Morrison. They fall in love with the idea of helping, but people aren't ideas. We're complicated and messy, and we don't always behave the way you expect us to behave. Then teach me, Alexander said. Teach me how to help without hurting, because you're right. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm trying to learn. A long silence followed. Then Elena's voice came back, softer but still wary. Meet me at the diner where I used to work. Tomorrow night, 7 p.m. I want you to meet some people who can help you understand what you're really getting into. The next evening, Alexander found himself in a neighborhood he'd driven past thousands of times but never actually seen. The 5th Street diner was wedged between a laundromat and a dollar store, its neon sign flickering intermittently. Through the windows, he could see worn booths and tired faces, people finishing long shifts, people stretching coffee because they couldn't afford food, people existing in the margins of the city he thought he knew. When he entered, conversation stopped. Heads turned. A man in expensive clothes was obvious here, as obvious as poverty would be in his penthouse. Elena sat in a corner booth with 3 other young people around her age. She waved him over, and as he approached, Alexander saw the mixture of curiosity and hostility in the eyes watching him. Mr. Morrison, Elena said with careful formality. These are my friends. This is Jorge. He works construction while studying for his GED. This is Camila. She's in community college while working 2 jobs. And this is Dante, who dropped out to help support his grandmother. Each person nodded at Alexander, but none smiled. They were evaluating him, he realized, trying to determine if he was another wealthy person slumming for the story, or if he might actually be different. Elena says you want to help people like us, Jorge said bluntly. Why? It was the most fundamental question, and Alexander found himself struggling to articulate an answer that didn't sound patronizing or self-serving. Because I looked at how I was living and realized I'd built it on top of other people's suffering without even noticing. And once you notice, you can't unnotice. Guilt, then, Camila said. Rich people's guilt trying to buy redemption. Maybe, Alexander admitted. Does the motivation matter if the outcome helps? Yes, Dante spoke up for the first time. Because guilt fades, Mr. Morrison. Then what? You've raised hopes, created dependencies, made promises. When guilt isn't enough anymore, what keeps those promises alive? These weren't the grateful beneficiaries Alexander had half expected. They were sharp, cynical, and entirely justified in their skepticism. He was beginning to understand what Elena had been trying to tell him, that help without dignity was just another form of control. I don't have a perfect answer, Alexander said honestly. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes or that I'll always get it right. What I can promise is that I'm committed to learning, to listening, and to using what I have to change systems, not just fix individual problems. Systems, Jorge repeated with a bitter laugh. You are the system, Mr. Morrison. You and people like you built this world where we work ourselves to death for scraps. Now you want to fix it with charity? Not charity, Alexander corrected. Justice. There's a difference. The conversation continued for 2 hours, harsh and honest and completely unlike any business meeting Alexander had ever conducted. These young people told him about predatory lending, about landlords who ignored repairs, about employers who stole wages, about schools that tracked poor kids into failure. They told him about the exhaustion of being poor, the calculations required to survive, the dreams deferred or abandoned entirely. And slowly, Alexander began to understand the depth of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a check and a feel-good foundation. This was structural inequality, so deeply embedded that dismantling it would require more than good intentions. It would require transformation of systems, of attitudes, and most challenging of all, of himself. 3 weeks after Alexander's education in the 5th Street diner, he found himself standing in front of Morrison Enterprises at dawn, seeing his own building as if for the first time. The gleaming glass tower rose 40 stories above street level, but now Alexander noticed what happened at street level. The cleaning crews arriving before sunrise, the food service workers setting up breakfast carts, the security guards who'd been standing all night. People who made his world function while remaining invisible to those who benefited most. Elena was scheduled to return to Lincoln Academy today. Alexander had received the confirmation from Principal Hartwell, along with a barely disguised tone of reluctance. But before Elena's first day back, there was something else Alexander needed to do. He'd spent the past weeks investigating his own company with the thoroughness he usually reserved for acquisition targets. What he found had shaken him to his core. Morrison Enterprises employed 237 people in building services, cleaning, maintenance, security, food service. Of those, 163 were classified as contract workers, meaning they received no benefits, no sick leave, no job security. Many worked multiple jobs to survive. Several had children who'd dropped out of school for the same reasons Elena had. Today, that changed. Alexander had called an unprecedented meeting, not in the executive conference room, but in the building's largest common space, usually reserved for corporate events. At 6 a.m., confused contract workers filed in, many still in uniform, clearly terrified that this early morning summons meant layoffs or policy changes that would make their already difficult lives harder. Maria Santos stood near the back, her posture tense with worry. She'd recovered from her illness thanks to proper medical treatment, but years of anxiety didn't disappear in weeks. Miguel stood beside her, having convinced his mother to let him skip his first class to support her. Elena hadn't arrived yet. She was probably preparing for her own nerve-wracking first day back at school. Thank you all for coming, Alexander began, his voice amplified by microphone but carrying genuine emotion that no technology could fake. I know this is unusual, and I know many of you are worried. I want to address that immediately. No one is being fired. No one is being disciplined. You're here because I need to apologize, and because I'm announcing changes that should have happened years ago. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Apologies from employers weren't part of anyone's expected script. I built this company on the principle of efficiency and profit maximization, Alexander continued. I structured employment to minimize costs and maximize flexibility for the business. What I failed to consider was the human cost of those decisions. I created a system where people could work full-time for this company and still struggle to feed their families, afford health care, or provide basic opportunities for their children. He saw faces in the crowd beginning to show cautious hope mixed with deep skepticism. These were people who'd learned not to trust promises from those in power. Effective immediately, every person who works for Morrison Enterprises, whether directly employed or contracted, will be offered full employee status with comprehensive benefits. This includes health care, paid sick leave, paid family leave, and access to the Morrison Opportunity Fund I announced last week. Additionally, wages for all building services positions are being increased to a living wage. Not minimum wage, but an actual living wage calculated based on the real cost of living in this city. The silence that followed was absolute, as if everyone had stopped breathing simultaneously. Then someone in the back began to cry, not sad tears, but the overwhelming emotional release that comes when hope crashes through years of resignation. I can't undo the years when this company extracted your labor without adequately compensating you, Alexander said, his own voice thick with emotion. But I can change what happens from this moment forward. Each of you will receive a meeting with HR this week to discuss your new status, benefits, and any additional support you or your families might need. This isn't conditional. This isn't temporary. This is how Morrison Enterprises operates now. A man in maintenance uniform stood up, his weathered face showing decades of hard work. Mr. Morrison, sir, I'm Travis Coleman. I've worked here 8 years. Why are you doing this? What's the catch? The catch is that I expect you to help me understand what else needs to change, Alexander answered honestly. The catch is that I'm going to keep asking uncomfortable questions and expecting honest answers. The catch is that this building is going to become a model for how companies should treat workers, which means we're all learning together. But there's no catch in the sense you mean. You've earned this through years of work that was undervalued. I'm simply correcting an injustice. Another woman stood, her voice shaking. Mr. Morrison, my daughter has asthma. We've been rationing her medication because we can't afford refills. Does the health care you mentioned, would that cover her? It covers everything, Alexander said firmly. You'll have comprehensive family health coverage starting immediately. Get your daughter the medication she needs today. HR will provide temporary coverage authorization while we process the paperwork. The woman sat down abruptly and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs of relief. Maria Santos reached over from the next row and squeezed her shoulder, tears streaming down her own face. The meeting continued for another hour, with people asking questions that revealed the depth of their previous desperation, about dental coverage for children, about whether they could finally afford to fix a broken car, about whether this meant they wouldn't have to work 3 jobs anymore. Each question was another indictment of the world Alexander had helped create and profited from. When the meeting finally ended, people approached him, not with anger, though that would have been justified, but with gratitude that made him feel simultaneously uplifted and ashamed. Travis Coleman shook his hand with calloused fingers and said, "My grandson can stay in school now. I was going to have to pull him out to work. You gave him a future." As the crowd dispersed, Maria approached with Miguel. Her eyes were red but shining with something that looked like hope, tempered by years of caution. "Mr. Morrison," she said softly, "I don't have words adequate for what you've done today, for my family and for all these families." "I should have done it years ago," Alexander replied. "I was just too blind to see what was right in front of me." "Elena's first day back at school is today," Miguel interjected, his young voice serious. "She's terrified. She's trying not to show it, but I can tell. She hasn't been in a classroom in over a year. And the kids there, some of them aren't kind to people like us." Alexander checked his watch. Her first class starts at 8? Yes, sir. Then I have time. Maria, would you trust me to do something that might be completely inappropriate? Maria exchanged glances with her son, then nodded slowly. I trust you, Mr. Morrison. Lincoln Academy's parking lot was filling with expensive cars when Alexander arrived at 7:30. He'd never paid attention before, but now he noticed the luxury vehicles, the designer backpacks, the casual wealth that students wore like a second skin. He also noticed the handful of students who arrived on public transportation or walked from bus stops, who carried worn backpacks and moved through the crowd with the careful invisibility of those who knew they didn't quite belong. He found Elena standing outside the main entrance, staring at the building as if it were a mountain she had to climb. She wore new clothes, not expensive, but clean and neat, and carried a backpack that Alexander had ensured came fully stocked with supplies. But her posture screamed anxiety. Elena, Alexander called gently as he approached. She jumped, then relaxed slightly when she saw who it was. Mr. Morrison, what are you doing here? Miguel mentioned you might need some moral support on your first day back. I'm fine, she said automatically, but her white knuckles gripping her backpack straps told a different story. You're allowed to not be fine, Alexander said. This is hard. You're walking back into a place that failed you, surrounded by people who don't understand what you've sacrificed. That's legitimately terrifying. Elena's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. What if I can't keep up? I've been working, not studying. What if everyone thinks I'm just the charity case? What if they're right to think that? Do you remember what you told me that first night in the kitchen? Alexander asked. You told me you spoke 9 languages and challenged me about what made someone intelligent. You demonstrated more courage in that moment than I've shown in my entire life. That person doesn't disappear just because circumstances forced you to pause your education. That feels like a different person, Elena whispered. That was someone who still had fight in her. I'm so tired, Mr. Morrison. I'm tired of fighting, tired of calculating, tired of choosing between impossible options. Part of me wonders if it would have been easier to just accept my situation instead of hoping for something better. Alexander felt a lump forming in his throat. This was the real cost of inequality. Not just material deprivation, but the exhaustion that came from constant struggle, the way hope could feel like a burden rather than a gift. You're right that hope is exhausting, Alexander said carefully. And you're right to be afraid that this might not last, that you might get hurt again. But Elena, you're also teaching me something crucial, that the people who've been through the hardest struggles often have the most to teach. Those kids in there, he gestured toward the school, they've had everything handed to them. You've had to fight for every opportunity. That's not a deficit. That's a completely different, equally valuable form of education. That's a nice speech, Elena said, a ghost of a smile appearing. Very inspirational. Did you practice it? I did, actually, Alexander admitted with a rueful laugh. Multiple times in the car on the way here. How'd I do? 6 out of 10. Needs work on the delivery. The smile became more genuine. But I appreciate you trying. The morning bell rang, and students began filing toward the entrance. Elena took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and started walking. Alexander fell into step beside her. You're not actually coming in with me, are you? Elena asked with alarm. Just to the door, Alexander promised. But I wanted to tell you one more thing. You know how you asked what I want from you in return for all this help? Yes. I want you to succeed so spectacularly that every person who ever doubted you has to eat their words. I want you to prove that talent and determination matter more than circumstances. And then I want you to come back and help me figure out how to help other kids like you, because you understand what they need in ways I never will. That's a lot of pressure, Mr. Morrison. Then let me rephrase. I want you to walk in there and be exactly who you are. That's enough. That's more than enough. Elena paused at the entrance, looking up at the imposing building. I'm still terrified. Good, Alexander said. Terror means you care. Terror means it matters. Use that. Channel it. And remember that you've already survived things most of these kids couldn't imagine. If you can work 2 jobs on no sleep with bleeding hands, you can handle a day of classes. She nodded, took one more deep breath, and walked through the door. Alexander watched her go, feeling an unfamiliar sensation, pride in someone else's courage, mixed with fierce protectiveness and hope that this time things would be different. He was about to return to his car when Principal Hartwell appeared beside him, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Morrison, I didn't expect to see you here this morning. Just checking on Elena's first day," Alexander said evenly. "I trust you understand that we'll need to evaluate her placement appropriately," the principal said. "Given her extended absence, she may need to repeat coursework or adjust her expectations about graduation timeline. I trust you understand that Elena will be given every support necessary to succeed," Alexander countered. "The same support offered to every student here. No more, but certainly no less." "Of course," Principal Hartwell said with a tight smile. "Though I should mention, there have been some concerns from other parents about special treatment, about standards being lowered to accommodate students who aren't quite prepared for our rigorous environment. Those parents can bring their concerns directly to me," Alexander said coldly. "I'd be happy to discuss how their children have benefited from advantages they've never had to question, while students like Elena have had to prove themselves against impossible odds. I suspect it would be an educational conversation for everyone involved." The principal's expression hardened. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you've developed a personal interest in this family, but Lincoln Academy has maintained its reputation for excellence for over a century. We can't compromise our standards simply because—" "Your standards aren't being compromised," Alexander interrupted sharply. "They're being challenged. There's a difference. Elena will succeed here because she's brilliant and determined. But if she faces obstacles created by prejudice rather than academics, you and I are going to have a very different conversation about Lincoln Academy's future." He walked away before the principal could respond, feeling anger coursing through his veins. This was going to be harder than he'd anticipated. Not the financial aspects, but the cultural resistance, the deeply embedded assumptions about who deserved opportunities and who didn't. His phone buzzed with a message from his CFO, Gerald. "Board meeting moved up to this afternoon. Shareholders are demanding explanation for excessive benefit expansion. Be prepared for opposition." Alexander stared at the message, then looked back at the school where Elena was beginning her battle, at the building where hundreds of workers had cried with relief this morning, at the city he was finally starting to truly see. Let them oppose him. He'd spent his entire life building power and wealth. It was time to discover what that power was actually worth when used for something more than accumulation. The war for systemic change had begun, and Alexander Morrison was finally on the right side. The Morrison Enterprises boardroom had witnessed countless battles over the years. Hostile takeover attempts, strategic pivots, executive power struggles. But nothing had prepared the assembled board members for what Alexander Morrison was about to propose. 14 faces stared at him across the mahogany table, expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. These were people who'd helped build his empire, who'd grown wealthy alongside him, who now saw their investment threatened by what they considered a misguided philanthropic impulse. "Let me understand this correctly." Marcus Sterling, the largest minority shareholder, leaned forward with controlled aggression. "In the past month, you've converted over 200 contract workers to full employee status, increased wages across all service positions by an average of 43%, established a benefits program that will cost approximately $12 million annually, and created an education fund that has no defined spending cap. All without board approval." "That's correct," Alexander said calmly, though his heart pounded. "As CEO and majority shareholder, these operational decisions fall within my authority. Operational decisions that materially impact profitability require board consultation at minimum," interjected Sandra Chen, the company's longest-serving board member. "Alexander, we understand you've been moved by some personal experience, but you're jeopardizing everything we've built. Our stock price has already dropped 8% since news of these initiatives leaked. Perhaps our stock was overvalued if it depended on exploiting workers," Alexander replied. The room erupted in overlapping objections. Gerald Blackwood, his CFO, tried to restore order while shooting Alexander a look that clearly communicated, "You're committing corporate suicide." "Ladies and gentlemen, please," Gerald called out. "Let's approach this rationally. Alexander, I've run projections. These changes, while admirable in intent, create unsustainable cost structures. Our competitors aren't implementing similar programs. We're pricing ourselves out of market competitiveness." "Then maybe our competitors are wrong," Alexander said. Maybe the entire model of maximizing profits while minimizing investment in human welfare is fundamentally broken. That's not your decision to make unilaterally, Marcus Sterling said coldly. You may be CEO, but you answer to shareholders. We have a fiduciary duty to maximize returns, not to run a charity. What if I told you these changes will ultimately increase profitability? Alexander countered. We've already seen productivity increases. Employee retention has improved dramatically. We're attracting talent that previously wouldn't consider us because of our reputation. There's a business case here, not just a moral one. Unproven theories, scoffed another board member, Richard Thornton. You're gambling with our investment based on feelings rather than data. I have data. Alexander pulled up a presentation on the screen. Since implementing these changes, absenteeism is down 37%. Employee satisfaction scores have tripled. We've received over 500 applications for positions that previously took months to fill. We're being profiled as an industry leader in responsible employment practices. That's not feelings. That's measurable business impact. In 1 month? Sandra Chen said skeptically. Alexander, a month of feel-good metrics doesn't justify the long-term cost burden you've created. The argument continued for hours, each board member presenting objections, alternatives, compromises that would preserve some changes while rolling back others. Alexander found himself fighting not just for policies, but for a fundamental shift in how success was defined. Finally, Marcus Sterling stood, his expression grim. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence. If Alexander won't see reason, we need leadership that will. The room fell silent. A vote of no confidence could force Alexander out of his own company. As majority shareholder, he couldn't be fully removed, but he could be stripped of operational control, relegated to the sidelines, while others undid everything he'd worked to change. Before you vote, Alexander said quietly, I want you to meet someone. He'd planned this moment carefully, knowing it might come to this. He opened the boardroom door, and Elena Santos entered, wearing her Lincoln Academy uniform, carrying a folder of documents. This is Elena Santos, Alexander introduced her. 3 months ago, she was washing my dishes at 3 a.m. with bleeding hands because she'd dropped out of school to work multiple jobs, while her mother, who was also employed by this company, couldn't afford basic medical care. Elena, would you tell the board what your life was like before these changes? Elena's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. 3 months ago, I slept 4 hours a night. I worked at a diner until 2 a.m., then helped my mother with her duties here, then went home to try to do homework I couldn't complete because I was too exhausted. My brother was on track to drop out of school because we couldn't afford his books and supplies. My mother was dying slowly from an untreated infection because medicine cost $200 we didn't have. She looked around the table at the uncomfortable faces. I didn't come here to make you feel guilty. I came to give you information. These policies that you're considering rolling back, they saved my family. They're saving dozens of families. Mr. Morrison asked me to calculate the economic impact of these families being stable versus desperate. Elena opened her folder and distributed copies around the table. When my mother was sick and afraid of losing her job, her productivity was down an estimated 40%. She made mistakes, took longer on tasks, lived in constant fear. Now she's healthy and secure, and she's training 2 new employees and has proposed efficiency improvements that have saved the company over $50,000. That's one person. Multiply that across 200 workers. When I was working multiple jobs, I was a drain on society. I used emergency room care because we couldn't afford preventive medicine, care that went unpaid and raised healthcare costs for everyone. I was on track to remain in low-wage work permanently, paying minimal taxes, requiring public assistance. Now I'm on track to graduate, attend university, become a teacher. Over my lifetime, I'll contribute hundreds of thousands in taxes and economic activity. Again, multiply that across dozens of families. The education fund supporting my brother Miguel, he's in accelerated mathematics. His teachers say he might have applications in quantum computing or advanced engineering. The cost of his education is $50,000. The value of his potential contributions to technology and innovation, incalculable. How many Miguels are being wasted right now because families can't afford to nurture their talents? Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. You're right that these policies cost money in the short term, but you're wrong about the long-term calculation. Investing in human potential always pays returns. You've just been conditioned to look at quarterly reports instead of generational impact. She placed her final document on the table. This is a report from the Brookings Economic Institute analyzing corporate social responsibility programs. Companies that invest genuinely in employees see average profit increases of 18% within 3 years, alongside immeasurable improvements in innovation, retention, and brand value. Mr. Morrison isn't gambling. He's making the smartest investment this company has ever made in the people who make it function. The silence following Elena's presentation was different from the hostile silence before. Board members studied the documents, exchanged glances, recalculated their positions. "Thank you, Elena," Alexander said softly. "You can return to school now. I know you have an exam this afternoon." After Elena left, Marcus Sterling cleared his throat. "That was well orchestrated, Alexander. Using an emotional appeal to distract from financial realities." "She wasn't an emotional appeal," Alexander said firmly. "She was evidence. Evidence that we've been measuring success by the wrong metrics. Evidence that the most valuable assets any company has are the human beings who comprise it. Even if we accept your premise," Sandra Chen said slowly, "you've fundamentally altered this company's direction without proper consultation. That's not how corporate governance works." "You're right," Alexander admitted. "I acted unilaterally because I was afraid if I waited for consensus, nothing would change. People were suffering while we debated profit margins. That was wrong procedurally, and I apologize for that. But I won't apologize for the substance of what I did." Gerald Blackwood spoke up. "I've been reviewing the data Elena provided. It's compelling. More compelling than I wanted it to be, honestly. If we frame these initiatives as long-term value investments rather than cost centers, there may be a viable path forward. We'd need to see sustained improvements," Richard Thornton said cautiously. "Not just initial enthusiasm, but maintained productivity and measurable returns." "I can commit to quarterly reports tracking all relevant metrics," Alexander offered. "Transparency, accountability, evidence-based assessment. If after a year the numbers don't support continuation, we can reassess." The vote of no confidence was tabled. Alexander remained CEO, but with the understanding that his social initiatives would face rigorous evaluation. It wasn't the unconditional victory he'd hoped for, but it was enough to continue the work. As the meeting adjourned, Sandra Chen approached him privately. "Alexander, I remember when you started this company. You were brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced that sentiment had no place in business. What changed?" "I saw the human cost of my success," Alexander said simply, "and I couldn't unsee it." That evening, Alexander attended something he'd never experienced before, Miguel's school science fair at Lincoln Academy. The gymnasium was filled with student projects, proud parents, and teenagers explaining complex concepts with varying degrees of confidence. Miguel's project was tucked in a corner, but it drew a crowd. He'd created a mathematical model for optimizing resource distribution in communities facing scarcity. Essentially, a formula for how to help the most people with limited means. The sophistication was remarkable, but what struck Alexander was the personal nature of it. This wasn't abstract theory. This was Miguel trying to solve the problems he'd lived through. "It's brilliant," Alexander told the young man after listening to his presentation. Miguel's face lit up with pride, then became serious. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you, not just for the educational support, but for believing Elena when she told you what our life was like. A lot of people don't believe us. They think we're exaggerating or looking for handouts. You listened. Your sister is hard not to listen to," Alexander smiled. "She's becoming quite the advocate." "She's fierce," Miguel agreed. "Always has been. That's why it almost destroyed her when she had to drop out. She tried not to show it, but I could see her getting smaller somehow, like part of her was dying. And now she's alive again. Angry sometimes, exhausted always, but alive. She came home yesterday and told me she'd argued with her history teacher about economic inequality and won the debate. The whole class applauded her. She was so happy she cried." Miguel's eyes were bright with emotion. "You gave her back her voice, Mr. Morrison. That's worth more than money." As Alexander walked through the science fair, he noticed Elena across the gymnasium. She was helping another student, a young person who looked as out of place as Elena must have felt weeks ago. She was explaining something patiently, encouragingly, the natural teacher she'd always been meant to be. He approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt. When Elena finished helping the other student, she noticed Alexander and smiled. A real smile, not the carefully guarded expression she'd worn for weeks. "Mr. Morrison, didn't expect to see you here." "I'm learning to show up in places I never went before," Alexander said. "How was your exam?" "I got a 92, Elena said, and the pride in her voice was unmistakable. 3 months ago, I couldn't have imagined taking that exam, much less passing it. My teacher told me afterward that my essay on economic systems and human dignity was the best she'd read in 20 years of teaching. "You've taught me more about those subjects than anyone," Alexander said honestly. Elena's expression softened. "You know, when this started, I was so angry. Angry at you for being blind. Angry at the system for being broken. Angry at myself for being powerless to change anything. I kept waiting for you to prove you were just another rich person performing charity for ego. And now I'm still angry," Elena said with a slight smile. "But it's different. It's focused. I'm angry at all the other Elenas who don't have someone notice their bleeding hands. I'm angry at all the systems that make people choose between impossible options. And I'm channeling that anger into something productive." She gestured around the gymnasium. "I'm starting a student organization to advocate for economic equity in education. We're going to push for policy changes at the district level, then the state level. We're going to make sure what happened to us doesn't keep happening to others." "That's ambitious." "I learned from the best," Elena said, looking at him directly. "You showed me that one person with resources and determination can change systems. Imagine what a whole generation of angry, educated, determined young people can do." Alexander felt a swell of emotion he couldn't quite name. "I didn't save you, did I? You were already saving yourself. I just got out of the way." "You did more than get out of the way," Elena corrected. "You saw us. You listened. You used your power to open doors that were locked. That matters enormously. But you're right that we're the ones walking through those doors. You can't do that part for us." Over the following months, the transformation continued to ripple outward. Morrison Enterprises became a case study in responsible corporate practice, written about in business schools and economic journals. Other companies, initially resistant, began implementing similar programs when they saw the measurable benefits. Elena's student advocacy organization grew to 300 members across 5 schools, pushing successfully for policy changes that expanded access to education resources. Miguel won a national science competition, earning scholarship offers from prestigious universities. Maria Santos was promoted to facilities director, overseeing the department that had once employed her as invisible labor. But the most profound change was invisible in quarterly reports or news articles. It was the change in hundreds of individual lives, workers who could afford medicine for their children, students who didn't have to choose between family and future, families who moved from survival mode to actually living. Alexander found himself transformed as well. The insomnia that had plagued him for years disappeared, replaced by a sense of purpose that made sleep feel like time wasted. His social circle changed entirely. No more exclusive clubs where wealth was the price of admission, replaced by community centers and school auditoriums where he was learning about the world he'd been insulated from. 1 year after finding Elena in his kitchen at 3 a.m., Alexander stood in the same space with Maria, Elena, and Miguel. The family was moving out, not because they were being displaced, but because they'd saved enough for their own apartment in a better neighborhood. It was modest by most standards, but to them it represented autonomy and dignity they'd never had. "I feel like I should say something profound," Alexander said, helping carry boxes. "Something about how you changed my life more than I changed yours." "That would be very dramatic," Elena teased. "Very movie-ending speech." "But true," Alexander insisted. "A year ago, I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. Now I have purpose, real relationships, the satisfaction of work that means something beyond profit. You gave me that." Maria placed a hand on his arm. "Mr. Morrison, you gave us opportunity. We gave you perspective." It was an exchange, not a rescue. Both sides needed what the other offered. That's much more profound than what I was going to say, Alexander admitted with a laugh. I'm raising philosophers, Maria said proudly. Both of them think too much. As Alexander helped load the last boxes into the moving van, Miguel approached with something wrapped in paper. Elena and I made you something. It's kind of silly, but we wanted you to have it. Alexander unwrapped the gift carefully. It was a framed photograph, the night in the gymnasium at the science fair, capturing the moment Elena was helping another struggling student. Below the image was a quote in Elena's handwriting. The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Mahatma Gandhi, Elena explained. We learned about him in history class. It made me think of you, of what you're trying to build. Not just charity, but a society that actually measures success by how everyone is doing, not just those at the top. Alexander stared at the gift, feeling tears forming for the first time in years. I'm going to hang this in my office, right where I'll see it every day. Good, Miguel said seriously. Because we're going to hold you accountable. You've started something, Mr. Morrison. You don't get to stop now just because you've checked the Help One Family box. There are thousands more where we came from. Millions, Elena corrected. And we're all watching to see if this was real or just a moment of conscience that faded. It's real, Alexander promised. I won't stop. I can't stop. You've shown me the world I was too blind to see, and I can't pretend not to see it anymore. Elena smiled, that fierce, determined smile that had first challenged him in his kitchen a year ago. Good, because we're going to change the world, Mr. Morrison. All of us together. Rich and poor, powerful and powerless, all working toward the same goal. A society where no one has to bleed into dish soap at 3 a.m. just to survive. As the moving van pulled away, Alexander stood in his penthouse kitchen, the same space where this transformation had begun, but it wasn't the same, just as he wasn't the same. The gleaming appliances and expensive finishes remained, but now they were just tools, not monuments to excess. The silence that had once felt like peace now felt like potential, space waiting to be filled with voices that needed to be heard. He looked at the framed photograph in his hands and thought about the year ahead. There were board meetings to navigate, policies to implement, systems to challenge. There were Elenas and Miguels and Marias in every city, every company, every corner of society. Invisible people doing essential work for insufficient compensation, making impossible choices because the system demanded it. The task was enormous, perhaps impossible. But Alexander had learned something crucial. Change didn't require perfection or complete solutions.
It required seeing, listening, and taking the next right action, then the next, then the next. It required using whatever power and privilege you had to open doors, challenge assumptions, and invest in human potential wherever you found it. He'd spent 48 years building wealth and power for himself.
Now, finally, he understood what it was all for. Not to accumulate more, but to redistribute opportunity, to challenge inequity, to ensure that talent and determination mattered more than circumstances of birth. Alexander Morrison had been a billionaire for decades, but it took a 17-year-old girl with bleeding hands to teach him what it meant to be truly rich, to see suffering and act, to recognize humanity in those society made invisible, to use privilege as a tool for justice rather than a wall against discomfort. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Morrison couldn't wait to get started.